one. You can mute the room, Chris. There we go. Thank you. So on the very first time for a Sunday school class for us, at least for my class, is that we are actually live streaming it. So I'm going to wave hello. And this has been an ask for a while now that folks who participate in worship via our live stream in various states and different places, they hear about Sunday school, want to participate, but obviously that's not an option, and have asked, at some point, could you live stream it? And honestly, that's a logistical challenge for me to try to do that. But Chris White, Chris is back there, and if you want to wave, Chris. So Chris is learning our system right now to help us with sound system in the early service, because we haven't had someone responsible for sound in early service. But then also to help us with the live stream for doing a Sunday school class. So this is kind of cool. So anyway, so they are hearing my voice right now, but I think when you speak, I don't think that it will be caught very well. So know that, but just in case, maybe, don't say, my name is Patrick, and you want to know what I think about Joe Bob? Yeah. This passage reminds me of Joe Bob. What a terrible human. This just know that. So, but anyways, so we're going to pick up where we left off in 2 Corinthians. So if you've got a Bible, go ahead and pick up there. And then if you are, for anybody that's watching the live stream, either live or later, welcome to the Bible study. So the whole idea for this class, we started January 2024, was to go through the Bible in 1 year. And we started in Genesis, and we started making our way through the Bible. So notice I said January 2024. It is now August 2025, and we're in 2 Corinthians. So obviously, we're still making our way through, but there's no use in rushing when there's good material and good conversation. So now that we're in 2 Corinthians, just a little bit about kind of what we've looked at so far. Paul is he's someone who's planted this church in Corinth like so many others. We're going to learn in worship today that a part of the vocation that begins to form for him, his kind of second act after being the zealous Jesus movement hunter, his second act after kind of this radical transformation is to begin preaching among Gentile communities, Gentile cities, and start putting together communities of both Jew and Gentile churches. And even says in Galatians, which we've already looked at, that he was commissioned by the Jerusalem leadership, at least at one time, to be an apostle to the Gentiles. So you've got Corinth, who the church in Corinth that has Jews, has Gentiles, and this messy business of trying to figure out how in the world do you get a multi-ethnic community, which is what this is. This is a multi-ethnic community of Jews and Gentiles from various places who have a spectrum of convictions about how to live faithfully to the God of Israel, the God of creation. How do you do that? And there are people in Jerusalem and elsewhere who are inside the Jesus movement who believe that what Paul is doing is way out of bounds. That if you're trying to figure out balance between how to be faithful to God as kind of a Gentile newcomer to the Jesus movement, there are many folks who think that, there are certain behaviors and traditions that you need to follow that our Jewish ancestors have for forever. But there's also lots of other convictions that just about that maybe don't even break along those lines of Jewish Gentile, but just, how if Paul is telling us that when we're baptized, certain distinctions no longer hold weight in the ecclesia, in the church gathering, like whether or not you're a slave or whether or not you're free, whether or not you're a male or whether or not you are female, whether or not you are Jew or Gentile, what are the implications in your life together? How does all that get sorted out and what you do and don't you, what you allow, what you don't allow. This is just, it's a hotbed of controversy. It's baked in, right, from the start. And so they're trying to sort this out. And Paul, as we've seen, is pretty controversial because he leans pretty hard towards wanting to make a very low bar for anybody to come and be a part of this Jesus movement, and has a pretty sophisticated theology that supports that. But rather than so much like in a Sunday school class like this, a lot of time, in fact, most of the time is spent on Paul's theological framework that supports it. That's important, and we spent some time talking about it, and we still will. But I really want to just amplify just the relational dimension to this, because as he's working out a framework and trying to defend it, he is feeling betrayed. There's a strained relationship. There's this ongoing correspondence with the Corinthians, in which he even describes some of those letters as being bathed in tears. So there's a lot of agony here. And the question I often have as I'm reading these letters, like if there's so much strain and there's so much just conflict and just it's so much work and it's so draining, like why does Paul try to keep that connection to a church like the one in Corinth? Why not just say, you know what, fine, if you don't want it to be part of me, like we'll go our separate ways, just you do you, I'll do me, so be it. Like why does he keep writing the letters? Why? Let me just toss that out to you. Why do you why in the world does Paul keep going with this? Like, do you think it's foolish? Like, bro, spend some time with people that want to hear from you. I don't know. Like, why do you think he keeps doing it? Yes.
If you look back to what kind of person he was before he became Paul,
Mm-hmm.
and how adamant he was to follow his religion, I think he's just being character that he is determined to follow this through.
Yeah. So Paul, we've seen throughout, if there's a consistent thread in his life, even before this kind of transformation, it's that he ain't afraid of conflict, right? He is not afraid of conflict, does not avoid it, and is certainly willing to kind of hold to his convictions and kind of like get into the mess. I think that's a really good observation, yeah. Yeah.
Before I ask the question, would it be possible that people can't hear us very well? Is that right?
I don't think so, but I don't think so, but I will tell you better afterwards, yeah.
It might be a good idea to kind of repeat the question
Yes,
before we start the discussion.
yes.
Kind of the essence of the question. I just offer that as a suggestion.
Yeah, like if somebody in the class offers a question to repeat it, that's a good idea. Yes, yes, that's a good idea, yes.
My interest is Paul was kind of stubborn.
Mm-hmm, I think that's true, yeah.
He gave the first round of Corinth and he didn't have much success.
Uh-huh.
I think he felt that I'm not going to give up.
Mm,
I'm not going to give up on what I've encountered because I'm so compelled. I'm led by Christ. I'm led by the Lord to do this.
mm-hmm,
And therefore, he would not just totally write it off.
mm-hmm,
And there are some churches where he did, but I think this is particular. I don't know if there's some special relationship he had with the church in Corinth. I really don't know.
mm-hmm.
So that's just a general observation.
Yeah, that's a good observation, just that Paul's extremely stubborn and in that he's just not willing to write anybody off, that he just, yeah. Yeah. Okay.
He was struck blind,
Yeah. Yeah.
and he was spoken to directly by the Lord. So he,
Yeah. So,
In addition to being called stubborn, I would say zealous
mm-hmm,
would be a good descriptor,
yeah,
and passionate about
right.
his beliefs, his experience.
So we might say that zeal certainly is a thread that runs through his life. Maybe the character of the zeal has changed, right? On the one hand, maybe the zeal is kind of modeled after, folks who defended God's holiness with violence, right? but then maybe after his transformation with that blinding vision with Jesus, that the zeal kind of changes character to where the passion and the drive is there, but it's, you might call it like a cruciform zeal. It is modeled in the way of Jesus. It is relentless, but it is also shaped by an unconditional love that maybe doesn't move with violence, but moves with a kind of unconditional love, and modeled in the cross, maybe. Yeah. Yeah, he was picked for a reason. Okay. Yeah, so if he was called for a reason. Yeah. Any other thoughts as to why Paul would keep going?
Also, I mean, anytime you try to enact a cultural shift, it's very difficult.
Yes.
And he had an additional barrier of, as we talked last week, he tried to establish his credibility.
Yeah. 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 I think it's a good point. So, I mean, that he's going to be going against the grain pretty hard, just like you would in any sort of culture where you're trying to dramatically do something different or bring in a new kind of culture. Sure. Yeah.
Thinking of like his project with the collection of the saints.
Yes.
Does he kind of have some interest in, you know, his project succeeding because he sort of presented it, you know, with conflict, you know, thinking of some of his earlier books.
Yeah, I think that's a good point as well. So like there's a vested interest. Like if his credibility is being questioned all around the Jesus movement, including probably most heatedly back in Jerusalem, for his churches to sever ties with him, or him to sever ties with this church, like that would not help. Not help his cause or gaining support for his cause and the gospel he's preaching, right? So, yeah, so there's a vested interest in maintaining this connection and not washing his hands of it. I think it's a really good point. Yeah. I may just also suggest that along with this kind of stubbornness we're talking about, another group that Paul very easily could have cut ties with outside of the communities that he actually planted would be those folks back in Jerusalem who are quite antagonistic, trying to undermine his churches. He could be completely done with them. And yet, as you alluded to, John, like one of his major projects is trying to raise this offering among the churches that he has planted to take back to Jewish believers in Jerusalem, to care for the poor there. And there has to be a kind of stubbornness that's going to ask that of these places that are, a lot of whom are already questioning you, and but to stick to your guns and like raise that money and do something that there's really not any other analog around to sort of say, yeah, we're doing like, you know, like this. It's something completely new and different, and he's just not willing to cut ties with even them, and that offering is a way to keep that tie. And I do wonder if part of the rationale with him is that for somebody who's so steeped in Israel's story and in the Hebrew scriptures, I do wonder if there's a sense in which the God of Israel didn't give up on creation in Genesis when it became, you know, up through, chapters, up through those first 10 chapters when it seemed like the creation experiment with God was a dumpster fire and God didn't give up on it. Kind of new strategy with Abraham and Sarah, or even in Exodus when God delivers the people from Egypt, and in the wilderness there's grumbling and like things were better. But you remember when we were in Exodus, like that was a theme, the grumbling and the ungratefulness of the people there, and questioning God and wondering if Pharaoh was better, and but God kind of sticking with them at Sinai even after the golden calf. I wonder if Paul even thinks, you know, God didn't give up on me. Like if there was anybody God could have washed their hands of, I would have been first in line. I was the one fighting the hardest against God, but God didn't give up on me. I can't help but wonder if that just on a gut level, I can't give up on these different communities. I don't know.
It's got to be frustrating for him too, because he's trying to do the collection. The credibility issue comes into play. It's like, oh, you're just keeping the money for yourself.
Yes. Oh, the charge had to be there, right? Yeah. Yeah, you're just going to keep that money for yourself. Like, because there's plenty of examples of teachers going around, even within the Jesus movement, teachers coming around, gives a nice message and then opens up their hand. Like, some would say that's the dominant model of how preachers work today. So, that's not too foreign for us. But yeah, I think this collection, which again was not a norm, yeah, be awfully suspicious of Paul. We're just going to trust you with all this money we've been raising? Like, what kind of cut are you getting here? Yeah. Yeah.
This might be a superfluous question or whatever, but Paul was converted,
Mm-hmm.
and he had a mission to all the people, Jew and Gentile, whatever. And I don't know, I haven't read the whole gospel in a while, I must admit that. But do you think Paul, in the cultural context of the day, felt a little affinity, a little closeness to the Jew or the Gentile?
I don't know. I think it would depend on the community. I really think Paul, I really think that he's more, I think he would feel very much akin to the person, whether Jew or Gentile, that really believes in this kind of union of peoples into a new kind of people. So regardless if you're Jew or Gentile, like if you think this is the signature thing that God is doing as the implications of a crucified and risen Messiah, this is the first fruit of a new creation, as he would say. Like if you believe that, that's who he would identify with, yeah.
Identified with Jew or Gentile. So
Yeah.
to say he favored one group over another, I think you pointed out correctly that he didn't know where he was a lot of times. But in the overall picture, hey, I'm going to minister to all of them.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to show any favoritism,
Mm-hmm.
etc.
Yeah.
I just wondered in the context, could he have shown any favoritism?
Yeah.
I don't know. I wouldn't know. I'd have to read it again.
Yeah.
If I could pick something out.
Well, I mean, he certainly saw his vocation as being an apostle, which literally just means one who's sent, an apostle to the Gentiles. He believes God has sent me to the Gentiles. And it doesn't mean at the exclusion of Jews, right? Like he's very much invested in the union of these people into a new people. But in terms of the emphasis, like he feels like that vocation is to make sure that Gentiles are an audience, the audience for him. So,
Stepped out to have any real strong relationship with the Gentiles. In other words, sharing their religion. I don't think they had a strong missionary type of movement to bring others in. I may be wrong.
that's a really good question. So let's say you take, say, like pre-Jesus, right? So was there kind of a spirit of wanting to spread the Jewish faith in the ways like people were? Well, not really. Now, what you did have some folks in the Gentile world who may be kind of like in close proximity to Jewish communities, and some folks might really like the flavor of their life together. They're kind of like theological clarity about the one God, and maybe had been drawn to that. Maybe had, for whatever reason, maybe a little bit of a bad taste in their mouth from some of like the pagan religious practices, and its kind of integration into the political world, how it all fit together culturally. Like maybe there was something that they liked, and so we do have examples of folks who just kind of out of their own agency end up kind of like being close by and learning more, and trying to adopt Jewish prayers, trying to learn more about Jewish scripture, and there are some cases in which some wanted to completely convert. They wanted to become like a proselyte of Judaism, and then we can see some records of debate as to if say a Gentile man wants to be fully Jewish and they are circumcised, like is that even good enough? Like is that even, like with all of the best intentions in the world, like can you truly be one of us, even if you go through all the steps? Like, some would say, yes, I'm not, but I think that's a pretty small minority group. But you're right, like, there's not like this, let's go plant a synagogue here and spread it's not that. It's a very different kind of thing, yeah. So already in planting churches about Jewish Messiah, there's already a very different cultural shift, yeah. So thanks for putting your finger on that, yeah. Well, let's get into 2 Corinthians here. So Paul, I'm looking at chapter 4 here where we left off. So Paul starts describing himself as appearing as a weak leader, and pointing to certain things quite ironically, like if his opponents who maybe have come to the church in Corinth and said, can you really trust Paul? I mean, that dude can barely like go through a week without getting arrested again. Like, can you really like trust that guy? Like, if God was so much in his corner, like, why does he always seem to be like in desperate need? Like, why does he always have swirling controversy, right? Like, why is he always in trouble? And so Paul kind of responds to those accusations in chapter 4 by basically saying that, this is evidence to me that I'm following in the footsteps of the Christ who, guess what, also had trouble with authorities, also was in need, also didn't have the best reputation, did not take the masses by storm. So, like, I feel like if I am on the path of Jesus, then all of this suffering sure feels like Jesus-y to me. And so then he goes on there in verse 7, but we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. So for Paul, there's another level to this, to his own suffering and theirs, if they see it rightly, that their suffering and yet miraculous ability to keep pressing forward and love and be an embodiment of the gospel, this helps illuminate the strength and the power of God. So yes, if they're going through a great deal of hardships and the weakness of them as a vessel is in clear contrast to the power of God that just doesn't stop, Paul thinks that's a good thing. He wants that contrast, which is a very different kind of thing from Paul's perspective that his opponents are putting up there. They kind of think that signs of weakness invalidate the message. If you've got a messenger who's in trouble, in jail, who seems to be persecuted, that kind of undermines the messenger. But Paul's saying, on the contrary, this helps illuminate the power of Christ that's at work in us. So he goes on and says there at the end of chapter 4 in verse 16, therefore we do not lose heart, though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. So Paul really believes that even in suffering, he's following that trajectory of Christ, kind of the divine status with God, becoming human, suffering, being crucified, and then eventually exalted. Paul feels like if I'm following Jesus on the suffering path and the profound humility path, then I'm still confident that I'm following Jesus all the way to that exaltation path. So, okay, shall we keep going? Would somebody start reading in chapter 5, verse 1? Because this is where he starts to get into another issue that is kind of controversial about his message, and he tries to describe it. So, could someone just start reading in verse 1, chapter 5, verse 1?
For we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this tent we groan, longing to be clothed with our heavenly dwelling. If indeed, when we have taken it off, we will not be found further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. He who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who has given us the Spirit as a guarantee. So we are always confident, even though we know that while we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord. For we walk by faith, not by sight. Yes, we do have confidence, and we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. So whether we are at home or away, we make it our aim to please Him. For all of us must appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each may receive recompense for what has been done in the body, whether good or evil.
All right, so let's just stop there for a second. So he's talking about resurrection here. He's talking about life after death. And he's talking about how when we're in this tent, is what he calls the present body, this earthly dwelling, we're kind of like groaning for that heavenly body, this new resurrected existence, where we are fully at home with the Lord. I said we can't experience it now. We just experience the bad side of the temporary, but we will be, but we're hoping in that new reality. And so, and then he mentions there at the end about being in front of the judgment seat of Christ, where you have to give an account of like what you've done, good or evil. So I'm just going to put a pin in something, and we're going to move on. I've often heard this passage read and interpreted in such a way that Paul is describing for the Corinthians that our existence on earth is temporary, and eventually we will die, and our souls will be clothed with kind of a heavenly spiritual body, and we'll be with God. But so long as we have this physical existence here on earth, we're kind of like waiting for that heavenly kind of escape where our spiritual selves, our souls, can be with God forever. And I just want to say, like, that construction, if you were to articulate it that way back to Paul at this moment, if you had a time machine, I think he might say, I don't understand your English, but he then would say, if he could understand you, if you could speak in Koine Greek or Aramaic or something, I think he might say, well, you're talking about Plutarch. Like Plutarch, that's a Neoplatonist. There's lots of like different descriptions as to like what life was sort of like aiming at, what the goal of life, what the destination was. But Plutarch had a very specific way of interpreting Platonism that kind of described the physical realm as a place of suffering that we were trying to escape to for this spiritual, perfect, heavenly existence with the gods. And so the divine realm, I think a lot of times we read Plutarch back into Paul, and I don't know that's what he was actually thinking or saying, but we're so immersed in it that in that way of thinking, because it became a dominant narrative, specifically in Western Christianity. But I do just want to just complicate it a little bit and just try to just ask yourself, well, if that's not what Paul was saying, what would he be saying? Or maybe even ask the question, no, actually everything I read, that's exactly what he's saying. So I don't know, I just put that in there just to keep an eye out for, okay? Go ahead.
Funny this week, listening to a podcast featuring N.T. Wright.
Oh, he's big on this. Yeah, yeah.
That was so intriguing because he was mainly talking about out of Acts 17, but then he also went here and said, I don't want to derail this conversation talking about N.T. Wright bringing up Platonism, but he was saying like how this sort of weak form of Platonism became dominant in Christianity, but in his view, like, we really can't get the full message of the Bible with this kind of Platonist point of view, and then talked a bit about Gnosticism.
Yeah. Out of curiosity, did N.T. Wright give an explanation or his own interpretation of that passage in 2 Corinthians 5?
It's one of the ones where, you know, it's one of those podcasts I probably have to listen to a couple of times to really
Yeah.
chew on it. I think this was the second part where he was in a dialogue with the moderator and Bishop Barron that I'm not familiar with. The Bible is a story of God not giving up on creation and people, but then He's here to redeem creation and not just escaping to some eternal heavenly realm that's entirely separate
Yeah.
from creation.
Yeah.
A new earth, a new Jerusalem.
Yeah. So let me just put it like this. So from the beginning of the class here, I kind of talk about like dealing with the Bible by wearing different hats. That's a bit artificial, but I think it helps. A lot of times we're wearing all these hats at the same time, but I think it may help just tease out what we're doing. On the one hand, we're reading kind of what's going on in the story, right? Like what can be said about the story that's being told in front of us. So like for Paul, like the story of his relationship with the church and why he may have said he was going to come visit and not visit and why. Like on the one hand, you're just trying to get your bearings on like what's actually being described on the page. Then that's kind of like I'm trying to like pay close attention to the text hat, right? Then you've got another hat, it's kind of like historian hat. Like I'm trying to figure out, okay, this is where he's writing this. This is like, let's say Corinth. This is the kind of city Corinth is in. This is kind of the size of it, the kind of economy it had, the kind of population it had, what were the controversies at the time, and what may have been like kind of the air everybody was breathing, and then kind of look at that cultural context of that setting, and then try to use that as a lens to hear what Paul is saying, so that you're doing kind of historical work here, historical critical work of like what the context would have been at that time in that place. That's one hat. Another hat is kind of interpretive hat, where you're trying to like, okay, given what I've noticed in the story, like what I'm reading on the page, given what I know about the historical context and situating all of what I'm reading in that context and what it would have meant, what is the analogy today? Like, is there an analogy today that I think is compelling to how I understand God and what it means to be a person of faith here in my context? And then kind of for me, that there may be a part of the process when you get to the interpretive hat and you're able to read a passage or read a voice from Scripture that you feel like you've got a good handle on what's on the page in the historical context, and you think you've got some analogies that would be very similar in our context, but you're just like, if the whole thing up to here has led me to kind of identifying what really is a good analogy, I don't think I'd have the same conclusion as, say, Paul in that context. That's part of the interpretive work. And so it may be the case that you read an N.T. Wright book like Surprised by Hope, and you may sort of follow him in making kind of all of these moves up to the present day interpretation, and where N.T. Wright makes the decision, I wanted to push really hard against any notion of like a spiritual heaven. You may make a different decision, and that's okay. We may agree with N.T. Wright. Actually, it does seem like Paul is preaching this based on what we read and what we know about the context, but I may come away with a different, what I actually believe. I may lean a little bit differently. So all of that is on the table, if that's helpful or not. So when you get to the interpretation side, I want you to feel free to go in any kind of way, including saying like, Paul, I'm not sure I'm buying that. So I just throw that out there. So we just flag that. Is it possible that Paul is saying something other than what we often think of as escape the body, souls go to heaven for eternity? Maybe so. Folks like N.T. Wright want to say so. But let's keep going. Can somebody start reading in verse 11 through the end of the chapter?
Therefore, knowing the fear of the Lord, we try to persuade others. But we ourselves are well known to God, and I hope that we are also well known to your consciences. We are not commending ourselves to you again, but giving you an opportunity to boast about us, so that you may be able to answer those who boast in outward appearance and not in the heart. For if we are beside ourselves, it is for God.
Can I pause there real quick? In that Bible there, when you say beside ourselves, is it in quotations or no quotations? It is not. Does anybody have a translation where it is in quotations? You do, Kay? We are out of our minds. This is where translating scripture is an interpretive act. So some translations will have quotes around "we are beside ourselves" or "we are out of our minds." And if you pick up a new NIV, for instance, or like the newer version of the NRSV, it'll be in quotes. Meaning what? Meaning Paul's quoting some of what's being lobbed at him. Like if we are out of our minds, or if we are beside ourselves, we're out of our minds for Jesus, right? So it's just interesting to pay up little details like that Paul may be here quoting some of the accusations that are thrown at him to undermine him. Okay, go ahead and keep going.
For if we are in our right mind, it is for you. For the love of Christ urges us on, because we are convinced that one has died for all. Therefore all have died. And he died for all, so that all those who might live no longer for themselves, but for him who died and was raised for them. From now on, therefore, we regard no one from a human point of view, even though we once knew Christ from a human point of view. We know him no longer in that way. So if anyone is in Christ, there is a new creation. Everything old has passed away. See, everything has become new. All this from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ, and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Christ God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting the message of reconciliation to us. So we are ambassadors for Christ. Since God is making his appeal through us, we entreat you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God.
Okay, thank you very much. So that first question, if Paul is got such a troubled relationship with the church in Corinth and other places like the church in Galatia, why is he just refusing to let those like fraying strands of that tie between them, why is he doesn't just let it snap? And it seems like the primary framework Paul has for the gospel, the good news about Jesus, is that when Christ lived, died, and was resurrected, that this was all part of God's project to be reconciled to the world, right? This is the very bedrock of Paul's conception of what happened in Christ. You've got God and creation, who have their own kind of fraying threads here of connection, and that the whole project of Christ living, dying, and being resurrected is so that the threads aren't fraying, but that there is a collision course of kind of like heaven and earth, you might say, that God is in full communion with creation again, right? Full communion. And so for Paul, if that is the whole project, it's a project of like divine and creation reconciliation, then following the Jesus who is supposed to be the very catalyst of that reconciliation, then he can understand his own work, his own mission than anything else other than being part of a mission of reconciliation between God and people, or God and creation. And so it seems like if there is this fracturing relationship with these communities, or even with folks in Jerusalem, like it just doesn't compute for him. Like the whole thing is this cosmic reconciliation. I can't let things go unreconciled. Like he's either going to get reconciled to these places or die trying. He even refers to himself and all of their mission as followers of Jesus as being ambassadors of reconciliation. If you look in verse 18, all this is from God who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. So the model here for Paul is that Christ didn't count people's sins against them, right? Like God could have like kept a cold shoulder and say, well, you did X, Y, and Z, and therefore this ain't happening, right? it was the very fact that there was forgiveness and grace for that that allows the reconciliation to happen. And Paul's trying to keep that in front of him as a model in very practical ways. And so he just, I can imagine a Paul in the midst of like trying to like choke out a letter while crying. He's got a scribe taking down his words, and he's got to take a break in tears and then come back and gather his thoughts. Like I can imagine himself trying to like remind himself over and over that God did not count my sins against me, that God is reconciling all of creation to God's self through Christ. Like that is, we have been entrusted with this ministry of reconciliation. Like it's, I can imagine him just reminding himself that whole time so he doesn't walk away, and that he can convince people of that same kind of ministry and calling so they don't walk away from him. He just, I don't know how best to say it, but dude's just hell-bent on like not walking away from a relationship. Like he just can't let it happen. And then I'll kind of leave it to you to decide if you think that's healthy for Paul or not. But that seems to be what's going on in his head. The logic of the gospel in his brain just prevents him from being able to walk away from a place like the Corinthian church family. And he does have this logic as well that we see over and over, and we'll see as we go on, that Christ just flips conventional wisdom on its head. Like if the whole world, by just using like conventional wisdom, looks at a movement whose leader is executed, you'd call that, well, too bad, right? That's a failure. Like, or, at the very least, like that's a failure of that leader, but maybe the movement can keep going. But for Paul, when he looks at the cross, that is the focal point for how to see reality. When he looks at the cross, he doesn't see a failure or the end of a particular leader. He sees the opposite. He sees a coronation. He sees an exaltation. He sees the power of love at work in the most dramatic way that then breaks the power of death itself, which is why Christ is resurrected. So Paul thinks just conventional wisdom is what is strong, what is weak, what is successful, what is a failure. Like all of it's flipped on its head because now the cross is the prism through which you understand what these things mean. And so when he tells the Corinthians, like, you got to let go of this conventional wisdom. If you have teachers that are saying, look, here are my credentials, here's kind of the evidence why you can trust me, and point to their successes and their journey that's kind of full of triumphs in this city and that. Like, it's just, Paul's going to say that does not compute with the logic of the cross. And so he's trying to flip their wisdom, and he's trying to help them see weakness in a new way that matches what they see in Christ. And at the same time, he is trying to do his one part of participating in this cosmic reconciliation by trying to bring some reconciliation on a very concrete level with specific communities. So let me just stop there and just ask for any comments, questions about any of that.
I think you just have to marvel at the level of Paul's conviction that he's not willing to bow down to any kind of controversy or any kind of conflict and stay true to his message.
Yeah, I mean, he is persistent. I mean, it is no question. I do kind of have to marvel at the persistence there for sure. Yeah. All right. Well, the question that still lingers is like, all right. So where do we go from here? What happens to that relationship? And so if you want to read ahead, we'll be in chapter 7, and you can kind of look and see how does that relationship evolve. So, thank you all very, very much.